Alright, now I should be live now. Let me go ahead and do something real quick. Hold on. Tonight we're going to be reading a book called In the Fog by Issei Sagawa. Now that's the one that won the poll. I had a poll of what to do tonight on the stream, and that's what won. So, second place was Fallout 3. So maybe we'll do some more of that if there's time. I don't know. It's already kind of a late stream, so you never know. But I maybe should bring up the Wikipedia article about this guy first, right? Because you guys might not know who Issei Sagawa is. And if you don't, well, I can show you. Tonight on the stream. So, let's see. Get the chat up here. Alright. Just make sure the stream stays going, and, we'll get going. So we'll start with the Wikipedia article of who Issei Sagawa was. If you don't know this guy, he was a killer who, he killed his girlfriend, and then he didn't go to prison, and then he kind of became a celebrity because of it. And that's not like an allegedly, like he legitimately was convicted and everything. But due to Japanese law, he was able to get off on an insanity plea or something akin to that. We'll look over the Wikipedia article first. Alright. So yeah, oh, he died? Oh, he died! Oh, shit! He died in November! I didn't know that! Yeah, because he was out and about for quite some time after he killed his girlfriend, but he died just around a week ago. Huh. Alright then. But yeah, he was also known as Pang, or the Kobe Cannibal. He's a Japanese murderer, cannibal, and necrophile, known for the killing of Renee Hartvelt in Paris in 1981. He murdered, then mutilated, cannibalized, and performed necrophilia on her corpse for several days. He was arrested but released after 2 years of pretrial detention upon being found legally insane and deported to Japan. So yeah, he was in the French prison for, like, he was in the holding, but he wasn't, like, in prison, and he got out by reason of insanity. So yeah. He wrote a book about it. Like I said, he kind of became somewhat of a celebrity. He wrote a book about the murder. He also wrote a manga about it. Yeah, he definitely tried to, well, he definitely capitalized on it. Let's see, here's some details about the murder. How about no Wikipedia? How about you don't get my money? Yeah, he invited his classmate, Renee Hartvelt, a Dutch woman, to dinner at his apartment at that street. And again, don't know the location is 100% relevant for our purposes, but yeah. Under the pretext of translating... So it wasn't even his girlfriend. It was a classmate at college. Okay. See, I had a few little details wrong. There we go. That's still visible. Alright. Again, we'll get to the book in a second, but I figure some context would be nice to know, right? So he claimed they were going to translate poetry for a school assignment. He planned to kill and eat her, having selected her for health and beauty, characteristics he felt he lacked. He considered himself weak, ugly, and small. He was 4'9". Okay. 144.8 centimeters, 4'9", so there you go. And claims he wanted to absorb her energy. Jeez. She was 25 years old and was 5'10". After Hartvelt arrived, she began reading poetry at a desk with her back to Sagawa when he shot her in the neck with a rifle. He said Sagawa said he fainted after the shock of shooting her, but awoke with the realization that he had to carry out his plan. He had sex with her corpse, but he could not bite into her skin because his teeth were not sharp enough. So he left the apartment and purchased a butcher knife. He consumed various parts of her body, eating most of her breasts, face, buttocks, feet, thighs, neck, either raw or cooked, even admitting that he swallowed her clitoris whole. Oh, jeez. Due to her being on her period. Jesus Christ, that's disgusting. And not liking the smell of menstrual blood. While saving other parts in his refrigerator. He also took photographs of her body at each eating stage. Once the remains of her body that he did not want to consume started decomposition, he then attempted to dump the remains of her corpse in, what's this? Okay, so a park. In a lake in the park, okay. Carrying her body parts in 2 suitcases, but was caught in the act and arrested by French police 4 days later. So yeah, he got a lawyer for his defense. He had a wealthy father that paid for his lawyer. He was found legally insane and released. And then again, like I said, capitalized on it. So there you go. That's a little bit of context about the guy we're going to be reading the book of today. But was caught in the... Let me just make sure... capitalized on it. Okay, cool, we're good. Just want to make sure everything was good with the stream. Alright, so now we're going to look at the book. So this is on a forum. This is someone doing a bit-by-bit translation of the book. It's not complete, but it has a good chunk of it. The earliest page I can find on this forum is page 10. So I don't know if that's the start of the book or if it jumps in a little later, because I know... hey, Corbin, how you doing? Ahoy, hoy to you. So yeah, we're looking at his book, and you know, we did have Pedro reading this book in Gary Got Revenge in Sergeant Friends, and we're gonna take a look at it. So again, page 10 is the earliest one on this forum that I can find. So we're gonna start with that. So his head was large. It was the only part of him that was. I guessed him to be in his 30s. He gave the impression of someone who shunned friendship, and in his eyes I could see timidness. Pulling these first impressions aside, I thrust out my hand to greet him. And into this he slipped cold, delicate fingers. Although slightly taken aback by how small his hand was, I pretended not to notice, feigning cheerfulness. I smiled and sat myself down on his bed. Until now, he had sat facing the wall at my right. For a moment, he appeared to be about to say something. On the wall hung a panel covered with newspaper cuttings of the crime. With the center taken up by the large photo of the victim. Is this how he spent his days? I wondered, staring at the picture. They're all about you, aren't they? Yes, he replied in a voice so thin it reminded me of the whine of a mosquito. I'm collecting them. Stories about yourself? So that's weird. He's writing this book from a different... So this is written by him. But he's writing about himself from someone else's perspective. I think that's really interesting. Stories about yourself? That's right. I'm interested in what they say. Again, I felt a certain surprise. You know, you're a famous person now. So that's the first page. Oh, look, a book. Yep. Hey, Andy, how you doing? Alright, now on to page 11. Yeah, and what fame it is, too. With a smile spread across his face, and for the first time I saw it in his eyes, a very different person. Suddenly, I saw something resembling a spiteful child. Again, it's really weird that, again, this is written by Issei Sagawa himself, but he's writing it from the perspective of someone meeting him. That's really bizarre. I recalled what some of his friends had told me before coming here. That there is something about him that almost compels others to offer him their support. This was probably one of the reasons he was able to remain so calm. Concerned that I might also fall into this trap, I said, "You probably know already, but I've been sent here by a magazine in Japan. I was told to find out about your case." Again I laughed, but this time the laughter was trapped in the back of my throat. I don't know if you've heard, but apparently the Prime Minister, who's currently here in Europe, has heard about you, and the Ministry of Foreign Affairs has even rushed out a report." "I did read something about that in one of the local papers," he said softly. "I seem to have caused a bit of trouble. Still," he added, with a titter that ended in a sneer, "I don't know what everyone's making such a fuss about. The sneer seemed to have been there all along. I suddenly glimpsed a hidden audacity within the shy young man, and I felt a slight unpleasantness taking hold of me." Oh, believe me, I also hate having to take the time out of my day to put up with any drama. Okay, Andy. Alright, page 12. "I continued regardless. Both here in France and in Japan, everyone's trying to work you out. Nothing like this has ever happened before. Psychiatrists are saying all sorts of things, and so are the newspapers. What do you yourself think? About what? I mean, all these different theories about why you did it. And everyone's talking about what you're really like. Although no one really knows. Do you know yourself why you did it? Not really. It's very difficult to explain. I mean, if I did know, then I probably wouldn't have done it. You could be right. But then again, I have this very strong feeling about why I can't understand the feelings I have. And that bothers me. Or that really bothers me. He'd lost me. But at the same time, I felt that I had discovered something hidden deep within him. I looked at him. He had been staring at the ground as he spoke, but he suddenly raised his face to mine and looked me hard in the face. I looked down and said in a low voice, "Well, how about telling me whatever you can about your thoughts? About how you feel? I know that I'm just a magazine reporter, but I've always been accountable for what I write. And if there's anything you want me to leave out, I know how to be discreet. Our conversations here will remain confidential, and you will have full control over what goes into print. What do you think? Do I have your consent?" He didn't move, but breathed in slightly, and said softly, "I have done nothing that I believe should be hidden from the public. You can write whatever you like. However, please write it exactly the way I tell it." "Of course," he said. "That goes without saying." Or, "Of course," I said. "That goes without saying." For a while, he sat staring at the ground. When he raised his head, his gaze moved to the picture of the girl on the wall in front of him. A moment passed, and as his thoughts seemed to move far beyond the picture, then with a slight tremble in his voice, he began. You have a good voice for this? Thanks. "I guess I'm becoming fully aware of her existence 1 month before the incident. Or I became fully aware of it a month before the incident. It was in the height of spring. We were in the same modern French literature class studying Dadaism. I had joined the class quite late. So I think Dadaism is like anti-art, if I remember. I know about Dadaism. It's like art that isn't art, like that guy that tipped over a urinal and said, 'This is art.' So that's Dadaism, if you guys don't know. She would sometimes pass me to get to her seat before the lecture began. All I remember noticing is how tall and pale she was, and that she always arrived with the same boyfriend. We certainly didn't have anything to do with each other. I'd never even seen her face. Only her back as she passed. I didn't even know where she sat. Then one day she sat down in the seat next to me. But that was not all. It appeared to be her turn to make a class presentation that day. When the time came, she took out her notes and in a rather high, excited voice began to speak. I noticed her manner of breathing, as if she were inhaling the same breath she had just exhaled. When she took a particularly deep breath, our lecturer, who was sitting next to me, encouraged her on. When she walked up onto the stage and sat down, I could make out her slim frame, and below a long pale neck, her well-developed breasts, which seemed to leap out at me. Instinctively, I felt her to be far away, but at the same moment, I thought that, even for a short time, I would like to be a friend of this woman. I was certain I had never met such a person before. I couldn't take my eyes off her. Her white skin was almost transparent. Her perfect features gave her elegance, and on top of that, she projected a refined friendliness that was unlike the coldness of French girls. For some reason, I thought she might be Austrian, and when I saw her, I thought of Tyrol and the snow-covered mountains of the Alps. You know what happened? You see what happens when you find a stranger in the Alps? But perhaps not. I thought in Austria I had seen many girls with large round faces. She was clearly different. Eventually I saw her reading a German textbook and thought to myself, that's it, she must be German. When I heard her speaking German in her clear and beautiful voice, I became more and more fascinated by her. However, I noticed that she grew more and more uncomfortable with my staring at her. Like I said before, I do greatly appreciate you still having another platform to live stream on when YouTube screwed you over for a little bit. Yeah, of course. That's why I have backups. Chapter 2. A couple of times she looked at me with what I thought was a couple of times she looked at me with what I thought was anger. Losing my courage, I averted my gaze. But by that time, I couldn't stop looking at her. On a whim, I decided I'd sketch a portrait of her in a notebook I carried with me. Needless to say, it was simply because I wanted to look at her. When I had finished, I noticed that the picture resembled the first girl I had ever fallen for. With her pale, delicate skin and clean-cut beauty, she wasn't somebody one could easily forget. However, the sketch failed to capture the softness of the young woman in front of me. I just didn't have the skill to depict her grace and warmth and vigor in one simple picture. But above all, the sketch had further unsettled me. I stared at her until her presentation was over, entirely unaware of what she was talking about. Once she had finished, a debate from among the students and the lecturer dragged on. From start to finish, she remained seated beside the professor. And from start to finish, my eyes remained on her. At last, when it was over, she returned to her seat next to me. She reached over and took her handbag and raincoat from the chair behind. As she did, the edge of her bag touched my arm, and I felt her turn to look at me. I could see by the look on her face she was apologizing, but somehow I found it impossible to respond. I probably felt a bit guilty. In the end, we parted without exchanging a word. She walked away down the corridor. When she reached the stairs, she appeared to run. I left soon after, and slowly descended the stairs. Another girl passed me. There was an exchange of words between the two girls, and I heard her voice floating up to me. I bought a ticket at the metro. As I climbed the steps to the platform, I noticed that she was in front of me, but I still couldn't bring myself to say anything. She sat down on the bench, feeling too uncomfortable to sit next to her. She sat down on the bench, or on a bench. Too uncomfortable to sit next to her, I sat down nervously at the end of the seat. Finally, the train arrived. She stood up and entered one of the carriages, and I followed. She sat down on one of the auxiliary seats. I moved close, but remained standing. We were both aware of what was going on. She had certainly seen me in the lecture. Still, I just couldn't bring myself to say anything. What should I say? I thought, until finally I said, "Do you have the right time, old man?" Sorry. "Do you have the time?" She pushed her wrist out, showing me the face of her watch. It was already 9 o'clock. With a note of surprise, I said, "Already?" "That's right," she said with a chuckle, her expression suggesting that I was already quite late. When the train stopped, I momentarily got off, but realizing my mistake, quickly jumped on again. At the next stop, I got off again. As I walked through the station, someone suddenly ran up behind me. It was her, and in a flash she was gone, disappearing into the darkness of the stairs. When I arrived at the next platform to change trains, I was surprised to find her standing there. For a moment, I stood catching my breath. When we spoke this time, conversation came easily. Smiling, I moved closer to her, and saw that she was also smiling. "I've got to be somewhere at 9:15. "That's tough, but why didn't you leave class earlier?" "But, was it because you were sitting next to the professor?" She laughed at this. "Are you studying Dadaism then?" I asked her. "That's right," she said, somewhat hesitantly. "I'm researching the dualism in the works of so-and-so. The name of the author escapes me. I'm also studying Dadaism from the beginning of the 20th century, and comparing it to the works of Japanese writers. In fact, I'd never had anything to do with Japanese literature, but then again, I'd never discussed Western literature with a European student before. I could never think what to talk about when it came to my studies. Finally, the train arrived, and this time we boarded together. She strode through the carriage and sat down on a box seat next to the window. The seat beside her was free, but I found the idea of being squeezed in next to her somewhat off-putting, and instead I made a point of sitting opposite her. Your reading makes me interested in the characters? Yeah. Seated in front of her, I stole quick glances. She wore a rather large, slightly worn raincoat. What looked like a hand-knitted sweater and a thin roll scarf. There was nothing decorative about her clothes. She looked straight at me with an air of fascination. Unlike French girls, who seem so dismissive of people, she felt like somebody I could become naturally close to. Are there Dadaist writers in Japan? She asked. Nonchalantly in my mind, the two words Dadaism and Japan could not have been further apart. I started to wonder what type of place she thought Japan was. For certain, she thought it was a very, very far-away island country in Asia. Again, I felt as far away from her as she was from Japan. Yeah, is all I said, and then added, but that was quite a while back, like over 50 years ago. What I wanted to say was that there was a similar literary movement in Japan some half a century ago. But it immediately occurred to me that it was simply an imitation of the West. Not even a movement. And I suddenly felt rather insignificant. I had inherited that sense of shame about my country, that inferiority that Japanese, for no good reason, feel. Or perhaps it was just the way that I thought. The way that I felt. She, however, continued talking in her nonchalant manner. Do you go to a lot of avant-garde exhibitions? She asked. I stammered. Yeah, plays, especially plays and stuff, I said. You need to do more readings? This is great. Okay. I will. I like how you can't help but reference and make jokes while reading. Yeah. In my mind, I saw us at a theater together, sitting side by side. When I asked her how many classes she had left, she said 2. I finish in May. With this, I thought she meant she wouldn't be coming the following week. And that was this last time I'd see her. And this was the last time I'd see her. I did a sketch of your face earlier on, I said, and then was going to add that I was worried that my staring might have made her uncomfortable. Instead, I handed her the notebook with the sketch in. As she took it, she inclined her head slightly. She looked at it for a while, without saying a word. It's not very good, I said, as some sort of excuse. But again she tilted her head slightly. A smile spread across her face, and she handed back the notebook. I often draw people in lectures, I said. I've done Beanel, our lecturer. Really, she said, again laughing. She got off at the 5th or 6th stop. Goodbye, she said, with a smile that stayed with me. I felt the end of her raincoat brush against my shoulder as she left the train. The chill wind seemed to carry with it the warm memory of her. I had felt enveloped in the warmth and calm. My nervousness subsided, and relaxed, I stared out at the platform. If this was really the last time I'd see her, then why, I suddenly thought, hadn't I invited her to go see a show when she mentioned it? However, I felt no regret at this. Instead, a smile appeared on my face. The day passed with her in the back of my mind, and a week later, I saw her again in the same lecture. I had just sat down at the end of the row, beside the aisle when she walked in. She passed right by me on the same row, and was just about to sit down near the opposite window when I caught her eye. She smiled in the same beautiful way she had when we had parted a week earlier. Behind her sat a French student and a Korean girl who was always with them. The two young women started talking. Being far away, I couldn't really hear their conversation, but it seemed to be about the t-shirt she was wearing. It was short-sleeved and white, with a picture of an Asian-style house and Chinese characters across the front. What are you wearing that for? She seemed to be asking. Maybe 'cause I'm a bit strange, the other girl replied, shaking a hand suggestively and making everyone laugh. Where'd you get it? The Korean girl asked. At Saint Michel. Maybe it was because I was staring at them, or maybe it was because she had told them I was from Japan, but the Korean girl turned to me, and pointing at the girl's chest, said, Can you read that? This was my chance to get close to her, and I moved over to join them, but she didn't even turn to look at me. I leaned over to read what was written across her chest. Directly in front of my face were her well-rounded breasts, and without thinking, I averted my gaze. Can you send me art in this Discord messenger sometime? Or send you your art? Yeah, I can do that, Corbin. We'll talk about that. I'll do that. I was unable to read the characters. They're Chinese, I said. I can't read that. With some hesitation, I fetched my notebook, which was lying open on the desk I had been sitting at. But I still hadn't the courage to sit down next to her. Finally, the lecture started. I was sleepy and dozed through the class, always aware of her white skin so close to me. When I looked up, I noticed another pretty girl sitting to my right. This one was typically French, with fine features and an icy persona. I had met her briefly a week or so ago, and she already knew all about me. She had an air of familiarity and a cold spitefulness that was a new and strange sensation for me. She had a rather dark complexion. When I compared the two women, the other reminded me, for some peculiar reason, of Tofu. When I thought of that, it made me laugh, which made me think to myself that although I barely know anything about her, she fascinates me so much. Did I really feel the presence of her white skin throughout the lecture? Or was it just my drowsiness? Eventually, the class ended, and the students filed out. However, she remained where she was. Hoping to find some common ground with her, I asked her if she knew a good book on surrealism. She stuttered, and then said, I've got to talk to the lecturer first about something. The teacher was in conversation with another student. This guy's just checking all the chicks out? Yeah, he is. Oh, by the way, Corbin, I mentioned this at the beginning of the stream. Did you know Issei Sagawa died last month? Like a week ago. Maybe two. Finally, she was the only student left. She and the lecturer exchanged a few words near the podium. She then returned to her seat on a small piece of paper, and on a small piece of paper wrote what I guessed to be her address. I didn't think it would be correct of me to be looking over her shoulder, so I moved away. She wrote slowly, taking quite a long time to finish. Finally, she stood up, handed the teacher the piece of paper, and together they went over to the window to talk. Two milky white arms extended from the short sleeves of her shirt. I started to imagine what the smooth skin of this woman must be like. And again, I realized how similar she was to my first real love. We lived in the same building, and in the summer, she would have come and sit in my room with her young arms exposed. However, she was always with the same boy. And on occasion, when we were together, he looked at her arms and said half mockingly, and there's a bunch of question marks here. I guess it's like, they taste good. She said, laughing. She shrugged her shoulders and, blushing crimson, said to me, Do you want a taste? Yes, I do, I said. I've never forgotten that conversation. Well, if that isn't excellent foreshadowing, I don't know what is. In fact, he had smiled in a similar way all through her presentation. To other less attractive women, his attitude was one of contempt. His sneer seemed to say, what a mess. Eventually, they ended their conversation and the professor left. Rip, good man. Driving back home from work listening to this. Intriguing book. Fucked up but intriguing. Yeah. I figured it'd be a good read, so figured I might as well, right? So next week, I'll give you that certificate of attendance, he says as he left, briefly looking at me. I felt his friendliness friendliness was even extended to me. We were alone together. Suddenly the classroom felt very empty, and this made me a little nervous. I was about to approach her when, without a word, she stood up and made to leave. I did the same, and we walked out into the corridor together and down the stairs. We said nothing, even as we left the hall. I was growing more and more nervous. Finally, when we left the building, she said, Michel Cadu's surrealism. Cadu? I asked a number of times, puzzled because it sounded like a Japanese name. I noticed two students, the Asian girl from earlier and a French boy, standing nearby. They seemed to be waiting for her. I felt a bit out of my element. Again, the conversation turned to her shirt. This time, I felt less hesitant about peeking at her breasts. As before, they rose and fell magnificently as she breathed. And I could actually sense a faint warmth coming off her. When I chanced to look at her face, she was looking past me, as if she were not aware of my presence, or bored with the conversation. In any event, she wasn't smiling. I felt slightly uncomfortable by the time we reached the street across from the metro. There was talk of dropping by a cafe. I had gone ahead, and after some hesitation, was about to say goodbye when the young man with us said, "If you want, you can join us." "Won't I be in the way?" I asked. "Not at all," he replied, adding with a chuckle, "Anyway, there'll be other friends there too." I also like your Lovecraft readings. Yeah, I need to finish the Lovecraft readings. I need to read Chapter 2 and the rest of it for Shadow over Innsmouth. Want to make art for the Lovecraft readings? Yeah, I know. That. Don't worry, you'll have plenty of opportunity for that, Corbin. We went to a cafe across the street. Students from my lecture earlier were sitting and talking in a tight circle. I felt this sense of wow. I felt the sense of wow. The students took up one whole corner of the terrace. We sat down next to them. I chose the seat nearest to the exit. She chose the one furthest away. Next to her sat the French boy. Next to him, the Korean girl. And then me. As I expected, I felt out of place, like I had been borrowed from somewhere else. A French student majoring in French literature joined the group, and I felt I had stumbled upon the unknown. It was slightly thrilling. A whole new world was opening up to me. The sun was still high. The roof of an old building on the opposite side of the street glinted brightly under the blue sky. She and the French boy ordered beer. The Korean girl ordered a cherry liqueur, while I, for some reason, ordered cocoa. Again, I felt out of place. All the other students were drinking beer or liqueurs. Two groups evolved, those who had arrived first and our group, which had come later. We discussed our lectures, and when it came to my turn, I spoke a little about the faculty and my own studies. The corresponding literature department at the Sorbonne doesn't have a professor specializing in Japanese literature. I had just started to explain when the French boy, listening, suddenly turned to the girl and said, "There is one, isn't there?" Yeah, it's true. I did just get done doing my SpongeBob Nintendo 3DS games collection video, which is 30 something. Okay, Andy. Why is it not going to the next page? There we go. There was something disdainful in his voice. Although I'm Japanese, the fact that Sorbonne has no Japanese language department was why I had chosen not to go there. However, he seemed to suggest that I hadn't gone in because of my lack of French. When it came to the turn of the Korean girl, I remarked without thinking how good I thought that her French was. Whenever she spoke with us, and especially when she spoke with the French boy, she seemed so fluent. But when I mentioned this, she and the boy looked at each other and burst out laughing. It was like they were saying, "How the hell can you say this is good French?" As if I either had no knowledge of the language, or that it was some cheap praise. I felt ridiculous. "Are you French?" I asked suddenly after hearing her speak so fluently. "Dutch," she replied. And her beautiful voice had an afterglow that left me unable to think in Japanese what Dutch meant. To be honest, until then I had never really thought much of the Dutch, or their country. People from Holland I had known personally seemed to think only about money. Like my previous landlord, whose feelings towards Japan I never clearly understood. But whose face was like the crumpled beret that I remembered from an English textbook. I'd seen it junior high. And whose cheese-scented hand, okay, extended from a stocky torso, left my own hand in pain when I shook it. This enduring image colored everything everything Dutch for me, from Van Gogh to tulips. This book's descriptions are good. Yeah, it's very, very detailed. However, this image dramatically changed when this slim young woman with porcelain white skin told me where she was from. In one go, I could feel my whole notion of the Netherlands slip away. When the drinks arrived, she took a sip of cherry brandy from the Korean girl's glass. Then the two of them wrote out their home addresses for each other. Rue Bonaparte, pronounced the Korean girl in her distinctive accent. What a wonderfully French name for a street. Although I felt that somehow wasn't right. I too asked the Korean girl for her address. It wasn't right, I thought, to know where someone lives without a specific reason. The Dutch girl began to read out loud. Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday. During the conversation, I'd wrestled with the notion of giving her my address. I had taken out a piece of typed paper from the bag on my lap and, so no one would see, written my address on it under the table. The paper remained on my lap until it grew damp and began to crease under my sweating palm. Sheepishly, I removed the paper from under the table and pressed it to the Korean girl, who was next to me. She put it in her bag without looking at it, but she didn't give me her address. She's probably wary of people knowing where she lives, I thought. And then suddenly I saw the Dutch girl pick up the red address book she had on her lap and hand it in my direction. It was the same book she'd previously passed to the Korean girl. It was small, quite worn, and with a faint smell of her hands. Write your address here, she said, inserting her finger into the book. Each page was marked with thinly spaced lines. With some embarrassment, I wrote my address on one of the lines. My apartment was called Villa Ilarange. However, I noticed that when I finished writing, that I'd left that out. So I added it immediately below. It was the most appealing part of my address. I returned the book to her. Tilting her head slightly, she looked at it, gave me a brief smile, and then placed it in her bag. Reacting instinctively, I took out a sheet of paper from my bag and passed it to her. Excuse me. Again, she tilted her head and slowly began to write out her address. When she returned the piece of paper, I found she had written her address in one corner in small round letters. It was then that I first learned her name, Renee Hartveld. Below her address was written Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, 8 a.m. to 1 p.m. What's this? I asked. The days and times it's okay to phone, she replied. This makes me want to do readings on my channel? Yeah? Yeah, readings can always be fun. I want to get back into doing that. I need to finish the Happy Appy sequel. Like, Dumb Angel. I need to finish my reading of that. And I need to finish Shadow over Innsmouth. But yeah. Let's see, where's the... there we go. What did this mean? Who is she speaking to outside these hours? An image of her, sprawled out comfortably in her room, speaking for hours on the phone to whoever it was, crossed my mind. Did she limit the times written below her address to everyone else? Those she didn't really like? With such a strict timetable, our friendship couldn't possibly progress, I thought. Still, I was glad she'd given me her address. I felt that it was a step closer to her. Let's all go see a movie or play, she said, glancing at the three of us, and indicating slightly with her finger. With that, the conversation turned to what movies were playing at the theaters. And then to West Side Story. I've seen it, I said. Me too, twice, she said, laughing. For the first time our talk was about something I was interested in, and our conversation became more excited. Have you seen The Sound of Music by the same director? Yes, I have. I've seen it 10 times, and played the record so much it almost worn out, I said. 10 times, the Korean girl exclaimed in astonishment. Renee, however, simply smiled and said little else. One of the students sitting with us got up to leave and was soon followed by another. Why are they going home? Was my first thought. Surely it's all just getting started. It's still early, and the weather's good. What's so important that they've got to go home for? I want to read Politics, H.P. Lovecraft, 1984, and Fountainhead on my channel? Yeah, there you go. Soon after, the French boy and Korean girl also got up and left. I should also go, I thought momentarily. But I found I just couldn't get up and leave. Does anyone want to grab something to eat? Said the girl next to Renee. Looking over at the other male students. I will, said Renee immediately, as if she'd already decided beforehand. I'll get you some French cheese, said one of the boys, laughing. I felt I wasn't part of the group, and peered outside thinking that I should have gone home earlier. As always, I was sitting closest to the door, and could have easily left if I'd decided to. Finally, as it began to grow dark, everyone got up to leave. Let's go eat, huh? They said, wondering when was the best time to say my goodbyes. I added my part of the bill to the coins scattered on the table. One of the students swept up the coins into his hand and went over to the counter to pay. The others followed. Only Renee remained at the table. You're not joining us for dinner, she asked me. Although this is what I'd been waiting for, I hesitated for a moment. But I haven't been invited, I said. Her face suddenly sank as she turned and went to join the others. She was dressed fashionably, in baggy pantaloons. Her protruding buttocks puffed out the fabric, leaving a thin cleft down the middle. She soon left the others and went over to the postcard stand. She removed one of the many cards showing scenes of Paris and studied it. Alright. I've got some ice cream down here that I was eating. I'm going to go put that in the freezer real quick. So we're going to take a quick break, but I will be right back with more reading. So sit tight. Alright, sorry about that brief delay, boys, but I am back. He's actually a good writer as well as a cannibal. Yeah. No, his writing is pretty good. Anyway, next page. I began to walk towards her. However, before I was close, she returned to where the others were. I left the cafe, and for no particular reason, decided to wait. When the others came out, I made out like I was about to head to the metro. Come and eat with us, someone in the group said. Had she told them to say that? I noticed a burst of light in front of me. It had grown dark, and the city's lights, silently enfolded in the deep blue of the sky, were coming on. Including me, we were 3 young men and 2 women. Smiling, one of the boys said to me, "We're heading over to the Descartes district." There was talks of going to a restaurant in that area. Pleasantly relieved, I slowed my pace and was walking beside Renee. All I know about Holland is cheese and tulips. Oh, and windmills, of course, I said to her, laughing. She smiled and said, "All I know about Japan is kimono." She pronounced the word softly, and I was somewhat taken back by how Japanese it sounded. The girl who had been sitting next to her in the cafe was also with us. She was an unpretentious sort, and with a straightforward manner. And as soon as she started talking, I thought of how much easier it was to talk with her. She was from southern France and knew quite a lot about Japanese cinema. Our conversations turned to movies and theater. Does this good writing make up for the cannibalism? Well, I mean, I'm sure we'll get to the cannibalism, since, again, this is literally a book of him describing, it's like his autobiography, right? All the time, I was acutely aware of Renee walking beside us listening, and I kept wondering what she was thinking, seeing me speaking with another woman like this. Among the narrow sloping streets of the bustling Latin Quarter is a small Greek restaurant with a terrace packed with tables and chairs that looks out over a side street. Although night had fallen when we arrived, it was still hot, and every table was full. We reserved a table in the corner and, with some time to kill, returned to the main street. When we passed a bar that, in faded golden leaf, called itself L'Habitu Ivre, I smiled and pointed it out to Renee. But she just stared back in puzzlement. How strange, I thought. She doesn't know Rimbaud? However, when I asked her how long she studied French for, she replied 6 months. I was amazed. Only 6 months, I blurted out. To be able to speak, read, and write French this well in only 6 months. It must be the common European language she shares, I thought, obviously. I didn't tell her that I'd been studying French for over 10 years. Instead, with a feeling of hopelessness, I almost said bonelessness instead of hopelessness, of hopelessness, I simply looked at her pale, chiseled face. I was again conscious of my Asian identity, of my coming from the Far East. When we went into a cafe and sat down in a corner, occupied by a small jukebox, I sat facing the French girl, and next to her sat the French boys. Renee took a chair from another table and sat at the end. Looking at the drinks menu, I decided that this time I'd order something strong. I'd shake this guy's hand, yeah? This book's gonna be awesome, yeah? Bonelessness. I decided to drink what everyone else was having, and then got up to go to the toilet. When I returned, I found that the French boy next to me had taken my place. I went to sit next to Renee, but with a consideration that I didn't really welcome, he offered to return my seat. Next, Renee got up to use the bathroom. Time passed, and she didn't return. I found myself wondering what she was doing. The truth is, I found it difficult to associate her with a lavatory. She returned eventually, to find the drinks lined up on the table. We toasted each other. "What is this?" I said, and while everyone watched, I threw the drink back in one gulp. Immediately, I felt a strong sensation in my mouth. I gasped loudly, and my eyes opened wide. "Cool!" exclaimed the French girl, sitting opposite, laughing. She seemed to be saying this out of consideration for me as a foreigner, but it had the effect of making me feel even more foreign. I suddenly noticed the 5 of us reflected in the glass entrance to the cafe. Almost enveloped by the white-skinned group and a small Oriental in a gray blazer, instinctively I inverted my eyes. By my watch, it was already 10:30. "Well, shall we go?" I said after we had listened to a few pop songs on the jukebox. I stood up and reached into my pocket for some change. "Okay, it's okay," they said in unison, waving their hands. As we walked to the restaurant, I told Renee about my trip to Greece the previous year. "I went once with my parents," she said, "but not to an island, to the city." "Athens?" I asked. But we had already reached the restaurant, and she didn't reply. Instead, she made her way to the table that one of the French boys was pointing to. Renee sat down opposite the French girl, and next to her sat one of the boys. Just as before, they seemed to be a couple. They seemed to be a couple. The seat next to Renee was free. Do you want to sit here? I asked the other French boy, beckoning with my hand. You sit there, he said, and so I sat down. Renee's bare white arms covered my eye. Caught my eye. So Renee's bare white arms caught my eye. I finally felt I was close to her. However, almost immediately she raised her hand to her forehead. I have a headache, she said. Water. Drink water, I said. Suddenly, worried that she might start feeling worse. Can we get some water, please? I asked the waiter. Aspirin, aspirin, somebody said half-jokingly. The water arrived. I'm okay, she said, when I asked her how she felt. From her appearance, it didn't seem to be a big deal. However, when the wine was poured, only her glass was left half filled. I can't eat much, she said. When the menu arrived... Me neither, said the French girl. The boys studied the menu in silence, as if their evening wasn't going so well. I felt they were somewhat critical of the French girl and her decision to not eat. Dinner was, after all, the most enjoyable time of the day. A Sergeant Friend's character should catch bonelessness? Yeah, okay. Yeah, I did do the SpongeBob movie Sponge on the Run DVD unboxing video on my channel, and of course that video, I say it's the best SpongeBob movie ever. Yeah, again, I don't know why you'd say... Oh, look, a bot. Welcome to Ban World. Alright. We all ordered from the same 30-franc menu, which was surprisingly extensive. So franc is a measure of currency, if you guys know. So it's the 30. I think it's like, I don't know how much that would be, because I don't think francs have actually been a thing for a while, ever since France joined the EU. So I don't really know what that would be currently and in dollars. So apologies on that. I assume it's cheap though. Your French has really improved, said the boy sitting at the corner to Renee. The friendlier of the two boys, he was a little on the fat side. The three of them had first met some 7 months before, and I tried to imagine what she was like back then. When she first arrived in Paris, was her French not very good? Or was it that she had a strong Dutch accent? Or could it be that they found her more attractive now? Renee raised her head to look at us, but said nothing. The talk soon turned to our studies. The people we knew, our hobbies and interests, and even the inauguration of President Mitterrand. You want to come with us to the inauguration? The fatter boy asked Renee. No, she replied, matter-of-factly. She was saying much, and I wondered if she had still had a headache. Talk of Greek food led to someone to suggest we eat Japanese next time. Another chance to meet up again, I thought. When the appetizers arrived, the French girl sitting opposite offered some to Renee. She took a little from the plate with her fork and popped it in her mouth. As I had ordered the same as Renee, the French girl offered me a taste as well. At the same time, the fat boy who had ordered likewise held out his plate to me. I hesitated, but then reached across the table to the French girl's plate. You always rob me of the opportunity to ban them myself, you son of a bitch. Alright, Corbin, I'll let you get the next spot. Wait, are you happy now? But don't fuck it up. You better get him. I took a little from where Renee's fork had left its imprint on the food. It had a garlicky taste that is typical of Greek entrees. Renee and I also ended up having the same meat dish as main course. I probably ordered the same dish deliberately. I guess I was trying to mimic her. We could see the meat, which was skewered, being grilled with some vigor that through a large window. We could see the meat, which was skewered, being grilled with some vigor, through a large window directly in front of Renee. With their heads slightly together, she and the French girl stared at the spectacle. Perhaps they were bored with the conversation, or perhaps they were actually fascinated by the sight. Either way, for a while their backs were turned to us. Beyond Renee's white arms, which in the gloom seemed to be slightly floating, I could see brown pieces of meat glistening in the red dancing flames. Even after the same meat had been put on the plates, been brought to our table, and ended up in our stomachs, a glimmer of light remained in the sky, and the crowds continued to pass by outside. Someone cheerfully commented on the evening. "What a lovely night. It's usually colder than this." "I know, it's quite unusual." Their conversation drifted over to our table, and at that moment I felt a refreshing and very pleasurable breeze that I can still feel in my cheek today. But we had just finished the dessert, and were waiting for coffee when Renee suddenly said, "I have to go home." "But I thought we were all going to a disco," someone said. I don't know, maybe Girls 69's videos were good? It was a bot, Corbin. "I've got an early start tomorrow. I've got to look after the kids," she said. She looked in her bag for some money, but she only had a 100-franc note. I immediately checked my wallet and found I had some 50-franc notes, which I passed to her, taking the 100 francs in return. Even though it was only money, I took great pleasure in her giving me something. I lightly probed the note with my fingers, searching for the warmth of her hand. She got up to go. While she was still standing in front of me, I said, "I'm going as well. I'm not really sure where the metro station is." Even to me, the way I said it sounded rushed. She took out a map and began to explain the directions to me. Needless to say, it was all a blur. I went to pay as well, but found that I had nothing smaller than a 50-franc note. We'd have a chance to meet at the cafe again, so I left the whole 50-franc note on the table. No one said anything. The smiling faces from the cafe earlier, when they had insisted on paying for me, were suddenly gone, and I felt some distance had grown between us. Renee thrust out her hand and grabbed the coffee cup in front of the fat boy. In one gulp, she swallowed the lot. "I must go," she said, smiling. The French boy had looked slightly surprised, but now smiled back at Renee. I felt slightly envious. "Well, adieu," someone said to her. I was somewhat surprised by this and blurted out, "But it's not adieu, is it? Didn't we agree that we'd go to a Japanese restaurant again? Didn't we agree we'd go to a Japanese restaurant together?" Maybe I should have clicked the link. Okay, Corbin. Yeah, you want a virus? That's a good way to do it. Oh yeah, that's right. Somebody said, and it fell to me to organize. Renee didn't give her address out to anyone else, and I was keenly aware that I was the only one there who knew it. Of course, I had no bad intentions. However, up until then, having spent dinner together, I had assumed that beyond all pleasantries, our relationship was already one in which we knew each other's address. Which is why I was so surprised that, after having spent such an enjoyable time together, she could get up with a simple adieu and left with seeming indifference. That she could be like this after we had spent 7 months in the same class, I found slightly chilling. While she was still speaking with one of the others, I quickly said goodbye and left. For whatever reason, I didn't want the others to see me leaving with her. By the time I had reflected the darkness of the street, she had caught up with me. Alone with her, I now wondered what type of woman she was, and why she was walking with me. In a way, she returned to being a total stranger. And I had a peculiar compulsion to at least introduce myself. Well, while with the others, we talked naturally with one another, but suddenly, with only the two of us, there was a disconnection. I felt we were facing one another for the first time. There was a sense, probably mutual, of us probing each other. "The streets could be dangerous at night if you're alone," I said to break the awkward silence that had descended upon us. She glanced in my direction and gave me a distant smile. I again began to talk about French, probably still surprised that she had managed to master the language in only 6 months. She explained that until 3 months previous, she had spent much of her time with an English friend, and speaking mostly English. Her French had hardly improved. However, it had really taken off after that. Renee began to talk about her apartment and how it was close to the Latin Quarter, and looked out onto Jordan du Luxembourg, which, far in front of us, was still only a dark mass. "It really is ideal," she exclaimed. I'll never forget the way she said ideal. She really enjoys her Paris life, I thought, and suddenly I recalled my own early years here, and how unfamiliar and difficult everything was for me. "Is this your first time in Paris?" "No, I came with my family." "Ah, then it's good you already know the city." Coming to Paris was the first time for me to have a passport. That is to say, it was my first time overseas. For Renee, overseas meant a few hours by train or car. My sense of overseas was entirely different. "I'll probably go to Holland this summer." "Amsterdam," she repeated herself. Amsterdam? And she repeated herself. "Amsterdam?" At the time, I'd never heard of Amsterdam, the Dutch town where her family lived. Because she spoke so quickly, I thought she was saying Amsterdam. I'd already decided that I wanted to visit her while there. However, if she had said Amsterdam, then it seemed to me the conversation had become overly general for a reason, and there was little chance of me getting to see where she lived. Maybe she had a vague idea of my intentions and had deliberately diverted the conversation. "Do you know the Van Gogh Museum? I really want to go. And also the Rembrandt one as well," I said. But she said nothing, continuing to stare ahead as she walked. Finally, we came onto a square to find the Pantheon. It's a huge dome disappearing into the dark. And now clear sky along one side clear sky. Along one side were white trees that, in the dark, appeared to float. There was also what looked like a hastily built stage. "What's that?" I said without thinking. "It's for Mitterrand's inauguration," she said, but I had already guessed as much. I felt the thrill of excitement and jumped onto the stage. "A socialist festival?" I asked her, laughing. Standing over by the stage roof, she also laughed. I'd had dinner with this woman. We would be going to the movies together. To a Japanese restaurant, we would meet again. As this passed through my mind, I felt simple joy rise from the bottom of my heart. With a new president, society was at a turning point, and there was a sense of exhilaration in the air. Up on the stage, I felt the urge to leap off. Instead, I climbed back down onto the road in front of the Pantheon. I really like Van Gogh, yeah? Interesting artist. Alright. Okay, we're still on chapter 2. I thought we were on to chapter 3, but no, we're still on chapter 2. Let's see, how long have we been going, by the way? We've been going for 63 minutes, according to that. What about this? Yeah, 63 minutes, give or take. Huh. Excuse me one second. I'm going to blow my nose. I know that's incredibly unpleasant, but it's going to make my reading sound better because I don't want to sound all nasally. Alright. Again, apologies, boys. She was suddenly caught in a burst of light from a nearby row of stores. Her illuminated shape seemed to float in the darkness. When we passed a cafe, one of the men sitting inside saw her and whistled, then shouted something. She really stands out, I thought. There are all kinds of people around at night. I just realized my Dr. Pepper was blocking the camera, so sorry about that. Anyway, there are all kinds of people around at night, I said, turning to her. She laughed and strode on with an air of indifference. She actually seemed unaware that men found her attractive. "My brother's been to Japan," she said out of the blue. "Really?" For a while I said nothing, but then asked, "What did he say about it?" I don't remember exactly what she said, but something about beautiful kimonos, and how he'd brought her one back. And that kind of thing, in my mind, I tried to picture her in a kimono. Eventually, we arrived outside the Odeon Theater. Through the glass, now unlit, posters announcing performances floated white in the darkness. "Have you seen any of the plays?" I asked her, but she didn't really reply. She suddenly stopped and said, "The metro is just up here, but I think the trains have finished now. I live around here, so goodbye." I was surprised at her rather abrupt manner, and I asked, Is it okay along here?" "Sure," she replied, flashing me a brief smile. It's 4:20 a.m., Angelo. Holy shit. Never mind, it's over now. Yeah, there you go. No time to blaze it now, right? But you will let me know about going to see a movie, I asked. "Ah," she said as if she'd just remembered something. And then very quickly added, "I have to phone Kim," the Korean girl. "Anyway, so whatever I decide, you ask her at the next lecture. I won't be there, you see." She told me she was planning to go back to the Netherlands for a week to see a friend. "See you soon, then," we both said, waving, and parted company. Without looking back, I set off in the direction of the metro, leaving the Odeon behind me. At the station, I found a long line of taxis. I waved to the car right in the middle, and the driver, who seemed to be in an extremely good mood, said, "Jump in." "With Mitterrand coming, no one wants to be sitting in a cab," he exclaimed, seemingly basking in the moment. He added, "There's going to be change." I found this excitement infectious, which only added to the excitement I already felt, having just left Renee. There were so many people about, it was difficult to believe that it was in the middle of the night. I could even hear my own heart beginning to murmur. "There's going to be a change. There's going to be a change." The driver and I ended up talking all the way back to my apartment. I want to ride a metro train, yeah? Alright, now we're on to Chapter 3. The following day, I began to think about finding a Japanese restaurant when it dawned on me that it might be better to have dinner at my place. Sure, I wanted to invite Renee to my apartment, but I also thought it'd be more fun than at some stuffy restaurant. I decided on sukiyaki. I made it once, some 10 years before I was a lodger in Japan. Sorry, my face is itchy. Some time ago while I was a lodger in Japan. However, I'd forgotten much of the recipe, and had to phone an acquaintance quite a few times to ask how to make it. I told the others at class the following week. Renee wasn't there that day. As was my habit, I stopped by the university cafeteria for a rest. There, I found the French boy and the Korean girl standing and talking. I smiled and was about to go over to them, but they were in deep conversation and didn't seem to notice me. Before long, however, they found something to laugh about. They looked over as if they'd noticed me, but said nothing. Instead, they carried on as they were. "Didn't you get a call from the Dutch girl?" I asked. They looked down at me, but carried on laughing. I was about to ask again when the Korean girl said, "What?" Her face darkened, and she frowned. Yeah, I did get a call," she said, and she giggled as if remembering something funny. The French boy had turned around and was now leaning against the wall. They both laughed together. As I was wondering what could be so funny, it suddenly dawned upon me that maybe they were laughing at how seriously I was taking Renee's proposal. "Well," I asked sheepishly, "did she say something?" Well, what?" she replied, finally suppressing her laughter. "I got a call from her at the weekend, about what you two were discussing. She suggested you go see an Ionesco play." "A play?" I asked myself. "Not a movie? Not West Side Story?" But the two gave me the impression that it didn't concern them, so I gave up on asking any more questions. Feeling very ill at ease, I headed back to the classroom. In class, they were still studying Anton Galland. For no particular reason, I sat where Renee had sat the week before. I looked out the window for a while, and took out some paper from my bag and began to draw a map to my apartment. I wanted to give it to the others, but I began to wonder if this map would even be useful. For no particular reason, a feeling of sadness welled up inside me. By the time I finished the map, the classroom was starting to fill up. I waited for the others to arrive, but not one of the three showed up. What could have happened, I wondered. But the lecture had already begun, and I turned my attention to the podium. This was my last lecture. I started drawing the teacher's face, but it just wasn't the same as drawing Renee. As time passed, I found myself nodding off. By chance, I turned around, and there was the French girl, sitting beside me. I suddenly felt much better. I even started listening to the lecturer. I took out the map and looked at it again. When the class was over, I waited for some of the students to leave, and then went over to the French girl, greeting her casually. I was worried I might have offended her by leaving early the other evening. However, she smiled and greeted me. I looked for a Japanese restaurant, but they're all so expensive. If it's okay, how about my place? I'll do the cooking, I said. Sure, she said, sounding pleased. This is my address and directions, I said, passing her the map. Thanks, she said. I wanted to ask you something about Japanese names, she continued. Although I was interested, I had to get permission that day from the lecturer to be absent. By then, he was already in the corridor waiting for me. You'll be in the cafe later anyway, won't you? I'll be there as well, so you can tell me then, I said. She seemed pleased. Yeah, sure. And with that, we went our separate ways. I started to walk after the lecturer. Without saying a word, he strode purposely up the stairs. Previously, when I had been with Renee, he had spoken to me in a friendly manner. Now he was an entirely different person. Have you had the opportunity to read my paper? I asked him. Although I had handed in my master's thesis, he said nothing at all about it. Not even that he'd read it. Because it was the last lecture, I decided to come right out and ask him. I agree with your teacher, he replied almost immediately, his voice monotone. The answer was probably his standard reply. I had the sudden urge to question him further. As for your teacher, he meant the woman examiner, who had probably left the note I could see tucked away into my paper. Had he actually even read it? I wondered to myself. Without a doubt, he had no interest in Japan's avant-garde movement, and must have wondered why, with so many other things to do, he had been made to read this. He'd probably briefly looked over the examiner's criticism and, because she was a co-worker, agreed with her. That's how it is then, I thought to myself. When I did speak, he immediately looked away, an attitude that, upon reflection, seemed a natural one. Yet again, I became conscious of myself as an Asian, as an Oriental. But, after all, there were only a handful of us who actually cared about our studies. It was hard for me not to feel I was enclosed on all sides, and that I could never escape. Was the professor going to the cafe as well? He was walking in the same direction, so I knew one of us would have to say something to him. What subject have you chosen for your dissertation, then? He asked, just as the cafe came into view. However, we arrived before I had a chance to finish telling him, and without waiting, he began talking with some other students. The Korean girl and French boy who was always with her appeared. He greeted me as a formality, but seemed mildly embarrassed to find himself standing beside me. He was always with the girls. I can't recall when I first noticed his presence, but I do remember him being surrounded by young women and flashing a childish grin as the other students entered the hall. In fact, there was something rather girlish about him. I found these types the most difficult to understand. I had lots of female friends myself. In fact, when one of them invited me to a party to celebrate finishing our thesis, a friend who I brought along was so surprised to find mostly women that he said half-jokingly, "This is kind of weird." I found being with a woman more fun. Nothing more than that. But at the same time, I was always aware of an insurmountable barrier between them and I. With him, there was something natural. That is to say, when with the opposite sex, he seemed to assimilate in a manner that made him feel instinctively uncomfortable. Still, that isn't to say I didn't feel a certain jealousy toward him as well. Still, there are some women who can't stomach this type. Judging from the other day, Renee has no great interest in him. Looking around, I realized that, although this was the same cafe I'd been to the other day, it suddenly felt like an entirely different place. "What on earth is she doing in Holland?" the French girl was saying. I couldn't see her boyfriend anywhere. Just as I was wondering where he'd disappeared to, I spotted him. When he saw me, his face lit up. We must have bonded during the other evening, as he seemed in very good spirits. I wanted to go over to them immediately, but the place was so crowded that I couldn't move a muscle. All of us, including myself, ordered cherry liqueur. Our teacher had a lot to say, so did a rather hysterical girl, who talked incessantly in class and was no different that day. I listened to the conversation at first, but soon grew tired. For some reason, I felt extremely tired that day. It was very different than the week before, when I could have sat forever in that cafe. As I stared blankly into space, my mind turned to thoughts of Renee. People began to leave, freeing up space around us. "Can I ask you something about Japan?" The French girl looked over at me. She then moved so that she was sitting next to me. I felt a sense of relief, as if I were with a close friend. She wanted to know how to write a French boy's name in Japanese. I was a bit surprised. For whatever reason, I'd forgotten katakana entirely. Japanese doesn't have an alphabet, she asked me. So I began to explain the Japanese used tones instead of an alphabet, and that these tones represented as kanji, when arranged somewhat laboriously in sequences, from meanings. Knowing nothing, she said, "That's amazing!" After this, I gave her my address and the map to my apartment. "It's going to be this Saturday because Renee will be back at the weekend. Although I'm not sure if she's free or not," I told her. "Is that okay?" "Renee?" the boy asked, looking at the French girl. "She's that Dutch girl." "Oh," he said. He began to say something about the weekend, but then stopped himself. "It's nothing," he said, adding that he understood about Saturday. "If the plan doesn't work for Renee, then maybe we could change it to Tuesday, or the following weekend," I said. Whatever the case, we decided that the French girl should call me Saturday morning. Soon after, the two got up, said a casual goodbye, and left. Although I had no thoughts of going with them, wherever they were going, I felt that their departure was all too soon. I was left sitting at the end of the table, alone. I sat there in two minds, whether to leave immediately and maybe catch them up, but then I'd probably be in the way. I could return to where I was sitting before, but didn't feel like pushing my way through the crowd. Alone and irritated, I occasionally looked up at the hands of the clock on the far wall. As I did, I became aware of how precious time is. I spoke no more in French that day. As usual, my professor was talking away. But he didn't even look my way. What was I even doing here, I wondered. I was waiting for an excuse to get up and leave. But it hadn't come. If I just put up with this a little longer, I thought, something interesting is bound to happen. I looked at the clock and decided to leave after 10 minutes. But after what I thought was 5 minutes, I realized it was already 10:30. I finally got up and began to put on my coat. Nobody seemed to notice. I could leave without even saying goodbye, and it probably wouldn't register. I felt miserable. I walked over to my teacher and held out my hand. "Thank you for everything," I said. He extended his hand and laughed. 2 or 3 students close by and I looked at each other in an exchange of greetings. The Korean girl, who was sitting next to the teacher, said, "See you," in a friendly way. It seems she actually remembered me. When I arrived at the metro, I sat down to see the skinny, hysterical girl sitting up at the opposite platform. The following passed through my mind. She either left early, or everyone went home just after I left, which means the Korean girl has gone. And therefore, if I waited a little longer, I may have been able to make new friends. That girl isn't here, the one that stood out from the others. She's a little older, and I could have talked with her. Although I had no real interest in that French girl, I began to feel the same way I had a week before. when I'd been introduced to what was, for me, a new world. However, once that thought had crossed my mind, I began to have regrets. Hang on just a sec, boys. I'm a bit thirsty now, so we're going to have a quick swig and then I'll get back to it. I noticed a group of women students on the same platform. They were sitting on the next bench, but with an air of indifference. Acted like I didn't exist. They were probably afraid I might start talking to them. They soon got up and quickly walked to the far end of the platform. Back in the cafe, they had done the same, moving off into a corner. I felt like someone had thrown cold water all over me. The train had finally arrived. I got on and sat in the corner with my head lowered. I was extremely tired that evening and went straight home. However, after lying in bed for a while, unable to sleep, I got up and took out a piece of paper. On it, I began to write a letter to Renee. I wanted to tell her that the party would be on Saturday. I added that, if this was inconvenient, she should call me as soon as she gets back. It was my first time to write her a letter. However, I found it came easily. I usually find it very difficult to write formal letters, especially to women I have only just met. And strangely, as I wrote, the tiredness I had previously felt lifted. On another sheet of paper, I began to sketch a map of where I lived. Again, I thought this would be difficult. However, after making a draft, I managed it in 2 attempts. I told her to get off at the second metro stop, where she'd find a sporting goods store and a bakery. But when I came to describe the easiest landmark, a Chinese restaurant, I stopped. Something you get from books you don't get from movies is knowing what the characters are thinking. Very true. As I was an Asian, I was worried about giving an overly strong image of the Orient. Instead, I wrote the villa in my address in extra large letters. I put the paper in an envelope, and when I came to address it, I took out the address she had given me. Tracing her roundish letters, I repeated her name in my mind over and over again, until I had completed the address. Although I'd heard that Renee was coming back at the weekend, I didn't know exactly when. I'd been invited to a friend's house that Friday night, however, because I was worried she might choose that evening to call, I met my friend for lunch instead. Still, I wasn't sure if she'd call or not, so I couldn't just sit at home in vain. I turned on the TV and began to watch a movie, in which I was soon engrossed when suddenly the phone rang. I instinctively grabbed the receiver. The voice on the other end was barely audible, was soft, high-pitched, and rather hoarse. I couldn't make out what the person was saying. The movie on TV was reaching its climax, and I had to ask again. It's Renee, in Sanchi. A friend and I met you the other day? Ah, I thought, and wondering how she could have escaped my thoughts, said hastily, Thank you for calling. Did you get my letter? I just got home. I asked my friends, but they don't want to go. So if next week is okay. But again, someone on the TV was shouting, and because the movie was coming to an end, this was accompanied by bursts of music. However, I wasn't willing to interrupt our conversation to go turn down the volume. By friends, a thought instinctively flashed through my mind, of the French boy and Korean girl, and how they had ignored me the other day at the university cafe. Perhaps she had suggested they go somewhere on Saturday, to a movie perhaps, and invite me, but the two had refused. So only the 3 of them would go, but by coincidence I had invited her to dinner that evening, so she suggested they all drop by my apartment on the way home. But again, they had rejected the idea. How about Monday then, or Tuesday? Or the end of next week even? Anytime's okay for me. How about we make it Monday, she said. I wanted to see her as soon as possible, so agreed to Monday. You called me as soon as you got back. Thank you very, very much for that, I said with honesty. Good, then I'll see you Monday, she said, after a short pause, and put the phone down. I can't say why, But the way she said good, bon, sounded so kind and full of warmth. I've spoken with enough to know how I loathe... I've spoken enough about how I loathe other people's feelings. I'm fully aware of this. But this was so obviously different to the way the French dryly pronounced the same word. It has remained with me ever since as a fond memory. As soon as I had put the phone down, I began to grow extremely concerned that I hadn't been able to hear her very well on the phone. Did she intend to invite me to join her the following day? I wondered. If so, I'd be able to see her the following day. Although I'd waited all the next morning for a call from the French girl, as we'd agreed, she never phoned. I started to doubt whether she'd actually intended to call. This had happened to me a lot, and I knew I was probably wasting my time. So I finally gave up at around 1 o'clock and left the apartment. What was she doing? She had shown such enthusiasm, I even wondered whether she may have lost my address. The weather was unusually hot that day, with the sun shining brightly all morning. Coats had been thrown off. Young women strolled around in light clothes, revealing bare white flesh. I thought of Renee's white arms from 2 weeks before. She probably looked the same today. I saw the two of us together, walking through a forest. I at her side, soaking in her health and beauty. I went to pick up some lunch from the cafe. Soon after I arrived, a young girl in white pants and her friend came chatting and laughing. They sat down at a catty-corner table. As I watched them exuding youthfulness, I thought of Renee, and if only I could be with her at this very moment. I was gripped with a desperate urge to see her. We could meet, I thought, but no, not on a beautiful day like this. Surely she wouldn't be at home. But before I knew it, I had changed my clothes, called a taxi, and headed to her apartment. Rue Bonaparte was a narrow street of shops. It was crowded with people. Standing there, loitering outside her apartment, I felt like a stalker. I was suddenly in a mood to make fun of myself. It had always been like this. I felt a maddening sense of guilt, which in turn made me feel ridiculous. But even then, I was unable to turn back. Her number was 59, but I found there were 2 buildings with the same number. I approached the one on the right and discovered a primly decorated store window, through which I could see dresses arranged in rows. The other building was marked B59. Knowing that B often indicates an affiliated student house, I decided to go in. However, the all-glass door wouldn't budge. It looked rather expensive, and I could see there was even an interphone. As I stood there, thinking that this was as far as I would get, someone came out, allowing me to quickly slip in. A thick red carpet covered the floor. Surely Renee, with her simple tastes, can't be renting a room here, I thought as I climbed the stairs, checking each door plate as I passed. However, there was no name written on any of them, or on most of them. I finally reached the top floor, and still hadn't found her apartment, so I turned back. I decided to ask the building superintendent, but I had no idea where his office was. Meanwhile, there was the possibility that I would run into Renee. Simply the thought of this made me blush. "You here, at my apartment?" she would say. And regret ever giving me her address? I suddenly felt a desperate urge to get away. Yeah, Fugitive Red Eye, you were a much different person 10 years ago, even though you were not uploading much videos at the time. Very true. I left the building half relieved that I'd found Renee's apartment. Once again, I passed the clothes store. But this time, I noticed there was a hotel up ahead. From its appearance, it seemed rather opulent. If I rented a room there, I could be close to her, I thought. I even considered recommending the hotel if someone I knew visited from Japan. Giving it one more shot, I decided to retrace my steps. That was when I suddenly noticed that just beyond B59 was a small door, which was painted with a grimy, half-faded 59 in yellow paint. With some surprise, I pushed open the door. Inside was a dark, narrow corridor, with piles of garbage cans. I entered and found a steep set of stairs to my right. Above, everything was dark. I took one step and then another. Surely this can't be it. I had the feeling that any minute now, she would come running down out of the dark. So, lifting my foot from the step, I decided to leave. On my way out, I noticed that a glass door to the right that looked like the superintendent's room. I knocked softly. Probably because it was Saturday, there was no reply. I left with the feeling that I had narrowly escaped, and immediately caught a taxi home. That evening, as part of my treatment for a whiplash injury I suffered from, I visited a shiatsu practitioner. I knew he was actually a student. Although my appointment was for 5 p.m., he still hadn't shown his face by 6, and as it neared 7, I could still hear him talking to another patient in the consulting room. Meanwhile, I sat waiting in the corner between stacks of books. To pass the time, I pulled out a few from the pile to leaf through. In one about Jean-Paul Sartre, I came across a description of how he and Simone de Beauvoir died. I came across a description of how he and Simone de Beauvoir first met. Yeah, I want to ride the Mentos train? That's not what he was saying, Andy. The piece was about how this shabby, seemingly unimpressive little man got so many of his fellow students besotted with him. For Sartre, there were always women. He knew what it was to be loved and filled with happiness. Reading this only made my own existence seem so infinitely miserable. 7 o'clock came and went. I was feeling desperate. Unable to wait any longer, I left. I'd taken a few steps when my left knee suddenly gave way, and I crashed to the ground. Looking down, I could see that my leg was half buried in the ground. I had stepped into a hole. Behind me, someone let out a screech of laughter. I turned round to find a young woman with blonde hair. Another woman would have refrained from laughing, but this one couldn't stop. As I approached her, feeling dizzy with pain, her face seemed to grimace. But I could see she was still giggling. With this, the sense of wretchedness I had felt moments ago, reading the Sartre book, returned with a vengeance. Compelled by a pitiful anger, I wanted to shout out, "How dare you laugh at my misfortune?" But with the pain and sense of humiliation, I was unable to speak, and instead limped back to the corridor outside the examination room. But, if I did feel guilty, a voice from within me said, "It'll all be over soon. Wait just a little more." In the end, I had to get a treatment for a bruised, swollen knee, as well as my whiplash. I finally got home around 9 p.m. Cigarette butts were scattered across the entrance to the apartment, something I hadn't seen before, and then it struck me. I looked in the letterbox, but there was no note or anything. My friends had probably been there. We'd made a plan for tonight. They would have guessed I wasn't there. Felt a bit put out, and then gone home. We'd planned to meet at 7. I was sure I'd be home by then. For the dinner party the following evening, I went to a Japanese store to buy some sake. Off the cuff, I decided to buy a tokuri set. And now Monday had arrived. I'd already arranged it all in my mind, and so, after making the bed, I set off to buy vegetables at a Japanese store close by Avenue de Opera. There was a lot to carry, and I had other things to buy as well, so I caught a taxi. Next, I headed to a nearby Japanese restaurant, where I bought some sashimi. Before heading home, I stopped by a Japanese confectioner's and picked up a bar of yokon. Hang on, boys. Let me take another swig here. Once home, I had to go out again. This time, to the supermarket to get everything I needed. Next, I phoned my friend again to make sure I'd got the yakitori recipe right. The time was flying by, and it was soon almost 6:30, the time we'd decided on. I took another quick look around the room, tidied up where necessary, and then sat down with a feeling of relief on a corner chair near the intercom. But would she really turn up? I had sat like this once before, staring at the spotless carpet, waiting in vain. On that occasion, I had decided to offer private Japanese lessons to French girls, and had put a notice up at the university. One girl came to a lesson, but then never came back. And no one else ever showed up. It was almost 6:30. She probably wouldn't come either, I thought. Some 10 minutes passed, and then the intercom above my head buzzed loudly. When I jumped up and grabbed the receiver, a slightly excited staccato voice said, "Renee?" Why does it always have to be the live streams where I have the time of my life that get taken down or privated? If you're talking about part 2 of the Valerie thing, Andy, I'm going to re-upload that. I just need to make some changes because there's some technical issues. I already brought that up. "Come in," I said, and pushed the button on the intercom to open the main entrance. I then quickly put a record on. The slow tempo of Handel's Mass began. Whenever I invited someone over, I'd always play this first. The soothing tempo set the mood of the room. It was perfectly suited to welcoming guests. Renee entered with a big smile on her face. I thought I'd be the last one to show. Maybe it was just me, but she seemed to be more dressed up than usual. I felt a pang in my heart. It wasn't as if I'd tried to deceive her, but no other friends were meant to come. I explained that I had expected a call Saturday morning, but nobody had phoned. "They may still come, you never know," I said. For some reason, I actually believed it at that time. "I had no idea," she said, but shrugged it off. She didn't seem that concerned. Her honesty was touching. "I was a little disappointed nobody called," I said, half truthfully, also half lying. "But I'm happy that you managed to come," I added softly. This time I was being entirely honest. She sat down at the top of the bed, and I sat next to her, leaving a little space between us. We talked for a little while, and I suggested that she have some tea and kaki. I'd already put out on the table. "It looks like no one's coming after all, so let's start," I said. I got up and went to the fridge, from where I took out the sashimi. "Today's going to be entirely Japanese," I said, and as I turned to look at her, she smiled. "This is a typical This is a typical Japanese dish? Have you eaten raw fish before?" I asked her. "Never," she said, again smiling. "Well, give it a try. If you don't like it, you don't have to eat it." Continuing to smile, she stared at the red flesh on the large plate. When I prepared the warm sake, I put some champagne glasses and the sake bottle on the table. I filled our glasses and we toasted. But when she came to drink, she tipped the glass back as if it were a beer. "That's strong," I warned her. She giggled. "It tastes good," she said. When I picked up my chopsticks, she took one look at how I held mine and then, quite by surprise, deftly did the same with hers. Without hesitation, she picked up a slice of sashimi and lifted it to her mouth. "Is it good?" I asked her. Yes, she said, smiling. Surprised at how natural her manner was, I was also impressed by the way she responded so well to a foreign culture. Until now, all my French friends had, to a certain extent, some knowledge of Japan. I felt a delightful surprise about how this woman, who knew almost nothing about Japan, responded with such ease and understanding. Pluck my ass. Okay then, Andy, that's a strange thing to say. Next I served the heated sake. Which do you like best? I asked. She chose the cold one, and then became surprisingly talkative. Dude, hot sake is way better, though. Like, if I'm giving my opinion, hot sake is way better. I found her fluent French difficult to follow. However, her buoyancy and the liveliness of her speech drew me in. Villa's such a nice name, she said. Things were going well after all, I thought. From there, we talked about each other's apartments. How much do you pay? I asked gingerly. It's free, she said. It's free? What does that mean? What does that mean, she said, repeating my question. 3 mornings a week, Monday, Tuesday, and Wednesday. I look after the owner's 2 children. That's why it's free. The phone number she'd given me was that of her landlord. The mystery of her address had begun to unravel. This meant that the number I was given was the one that everyone used, and that I had just been imagining things. It was soon time for the main dish, the sukiyaki. I'm going to do the cooking. It's my first time, so I don't know if it'll be any good, I said, although I actually felt terribly anxious. Can I help with anything? Not a thing. You're my guest today. So you just stay where you are, I said, cutting the Chinese cabbage. Can I have a look at your record? She asked, as I was taking the meat out of the fridge. Of course. And I turned around suddenly to find her sitting quietly in front of the stereo, her long legs folded under her. You like Delita? I'll give you that. First you made me say pluck, then you made me say fuck, and finally you made me say what? Okay then, Andy. Yeah, she's okay. I've seen her twice in concert. Any good? Not bad. You see the album cover over there? Yeah. That one? Yeah, that one? That's Princess Grace. Hearing this, Renee sat there and stared at the face on the cover, saying nothing. I was a fan of Princess Grace, or rather, Grace Kelly. If there's something you want to listen to, just say, I said after she sat back on the bed. She thought for a while and then exclaimed, Beethoven. Ah, dude, this chick wants a little bit of the old Ludwig van. Hell yeah. That's a real horror show, if I do say so myself. And as she did, she pushed her neck slightly forward. Most of my records were Beethoven. Orchestra or chorus? Orchestra. So I decided on the third movement from Symphony No. 9. When the record reached the choral part, she said, Did you know that they sang this at Mitterrand's inauguration? Yeah, she continued, as if recalling the event. She looked up at me and smiled. I heard it from the Pantheon. So you went then? Yeah. Previously, while having dinner in Rue Descartes, a friend had invited her to go to the event, but she had declined. I was therefore surprised to hear she'd gone after all. I'd borrowed a camping stove from a friend in preparation, but I was having trouble getting it to work. Finally, when it was time to light it, I realized I had no matches and had to go downstairs to borrow some from the landlord. This is good? Yeah, this is good. I almost burned myself a number of times trying to light the thing. Each time I reacted by pulling my hand back. As I did so, I noticed the smile on Renee's face turn to a look of concern. Had she run out of patience with me already? I wondered. I finally did get the stove lit and placed the nabe on top of it. After I had stirred the oil and added some vegetables, I put in the meat. However, and not surprisingly, it started to turn black and smoke almost immediately. Soon, smoke began to fill the room. With stinging eyes and coughing fits, We went over to the window and opened the door, before ending up in the middle of the room in a state of panic. "Does that open?" she asked, pointing at the window above my desk that I always kept closed. I pulled back the curtains and with some effort pushed it open. From there, I could clearly see the garden that stretched from the entrance to the building. "It's the first time I've ever opened this. What a nice view," I said. Thanks to this, the smoke began to recede. It was then that the doorbell rang. Wondering who that could be, I opened the door to find the mademoiselle who lived immediately above me. "Excuse me, but has something happened?" she said with a rigid smile, although she seemed slightly flurried as she stood there out of breath. "Oh, it's nothing. I was cooking and it got a bit smoky. Not to worry," I told her. "I understand," she said with a chuckle, and returned upstairs to her apartment. I'd run into her many times before, but I'd never seen her with a smile on her face. Even though this change of mood was a good thing, I still thought it odd. Could it be that Renee's presence had this effect? But she couldn't have known about Renee, as she'd been inside the room all the time sitting on the bed. Issei Sagawa did pass away recently on November 24th, 2022 at the age of 73. Yeah, I brought that up at the beginning of the stream, Andy. It must have been my manner. Renee's presence has changed me somehow. My neighbor probably saw me as happy and without a care. Laughing, I went back to the room. "It was the woman from upstairs. She rushed down thinking there was a fire," I said. The look of concern on Renee's face turned to a smile. I scraped the charred meat from the bottom of the nabe pot, while asking myself why it had turned out like this. Then, gradually added water and more meat. This time there wasn't so much smoke. Even still, the meat I handed to Renee was overcooked and hard, but she said it was fine when I asked her, and picked up a piece with her chopsticks. "You're very good at using those," I said, watching her hand. Again, I showed her how I was holding my chopsticks. "The thumb is important," I explained, and taking her hand in mine, I gently touched her thumb. Her hand was larger and stronger than I'd expected. From that one small touch, I felt a faint warmth from her body flow into mine, and a slight tremble within me. When that girl who I mentioned was my first love would come to my apartment with her boyfriend, he would often stroke and caress her hand, and sometimes even her arm on such occasions. I couldn't help but sneak a peek at her white skin. But I would soon find myself having trouble breathing. The two of them weren't particularly in love. On top of that, she was known as a cleanliness freak. Like when she picked up a man's suit, she would hold it between her fingers as if it were something dirty. Thinking of this, how she would giggle and let herself be so easily stroked and patted. And there was me, who couldn't cook to save my life, and had never even touched the tips of her fingers. I suddenly felt overcome by my emotions. Alright. Give me 1 second. I'm going to blow my nose again real quick. That was my first love, and although it was only I that was in love, and not her, she certainly knew how I felt. Her way of responding was, however, unconsciously, to rub me the wrong way. That was how our so-called relationship was. This experience doesn't only apply to her. Whenever I saw a man accustomed to being around women touch a girl on the hand or shoulder, a girl that he didn't know well, I would realize that there is a world unfathomable to me, a world that, from the very beginning, has kept me out. It didn't matter what the situation, I thought. I could never do the same. However, today, for the first time, alone with this Dutch girl, I hesitantly gave it a go. But when I touched her large, long fingers, I noticed my own thin fingers and instinctively withdrew my hand. As usual, she flashed a big smile, staring straight at me, spoke quickly. The lamp on the desk cast a diagonal light downward. She had no eyebrows. Normally I would think this strange. With her slightly round, youthful, smiling face, she was pretty. Her plump bottom lip glistened with oil from the meat. But she continued talking without care. I stood up, took some cervettes from the cupboard, and passed them to her. For the first time, it seemed she took notice, and for a moment didn't utter a word. "Thanks," is all she said, and wiped her mouth. After I'd asked her what she did about food, we got on to talking about the cafeteria at the university. "I don't know any other places," she said, "but we could try some eateries near the Sorbonne." With this, she playfully wiggled the tip of her tongue back and forth across her mouth and shook her head. Although this was a gesture meant to suggest that the food there was awful, I found it somewhat crude, slightly boyish even. She was certainly unlike my previous female friends, all of whom had tended to be petite, somewhat delicate, and, at the same time, rather highly strung. However, with this young woman, her long legs and jeans stretching almost to the corner of the desk in front of her, it wasn't a delicacy that I sensed, but an easygoing warmth. At the same time, I was clearly aware of her youthful vigor and vitality. In the life she radiated with each breath, I felt my own feebleness. No, this is all probably mostly her fault as well. "What kind of meat do you eat in Japan?" This she asked suddenly as I was placing the meat in the nabe, which was bubbling away noisily. "Well, pretty much the same as here. Beef, pork, not so much mutton," I said, wondering why she was asking this. "And women like you," I was going to say as a joke, but the words didn't come. Oh boy. Perhaps she would have laughed and shrugged it off, or, knowing nothing about the Far East, perhaps she would have thought I was being serious. This would then cause her to suddenly fear me, leaving her awkwardly on guard. While having sex with prostitutes and biting into their large round buttocks, I've had the urge to tell them that we eat European women in Japan. But now, sitting in front of this young woman, however much I thought I could pass it off as a joke, I couldn't bring myself to say it. At that moment, the Kreutzer Sonata began playing on the record player. How the music, so tender and soft, seemed to float through the air, I thought. And as I did, I felt myself melting into her cheeks. Now, white with a trace of scarlet, I said, quite unconsciously, "This music is so beautiful." Putting her head slightly to one side, her response was simply, "Yes." The conversation turned to the French, with her saying that the French people know nothing about other countries. "When I say I'm from the Netherlands, I often get told Holland is just the same as Belgium and Germany," she said with a smile. So I told her about my own experience. "When I went to the laundrette, I was told by the owner that the French can't make anything themselves. 'Take this washing machine,' he said to me. 'It's made in Belgium.' But then when I looked at the name on the machine, I could see it was German. Belgium, Germany, Holland, they're all the same," is all he could say. "That's right," she said, laughing loudly and nodding with approval. "I think the Dutch are much more cosmopolitan than the French," she said. "Still, my grandmother always used to say that foreigners were no good." This was said with evident amusement, but she quickly added endearingly, "She's dead now." And with this, tears suddenly came up to her eyes. In the middle of this rush of words, she'd suddenly revealed she had a softer side, one that I found heartwarming. I took her plate with the intention of putting some meat on it, and from her hand I took her chopsticks. She appeared somewhat surprised by this, and for a moment said nothing. I figured that it must be rude in Europe to touch someone else's tableware. Still, it was better using hers than mine, I thought. The chopsticks had absorbed her body heat. I felt closer to her than I felt closer. Sorry, I'm stumbling. I felt closer to her than if I'd touched her on the hand. If it's too much, then leave some, I said, becoming a little concerned. This is my last piece, she said. And with these few words, the way that she gestured spontaneously and relaxed, she was telling me that she wasn't worried, that she didn't object. With her chopsticks still in my hand, I took some more meat from the plate and dropped it into the nobby. Then, using the same chopsticks, I stirred the pot. After handing them back, I took some of the burnt meat from where I'd stirred the pot and popped it in my mouth. With the sukiyaki pot back on the gas stove in the kitchen, I gave the table a wipe and brought out the yokon. While I did this, she sat with her back to me, facing the bookshelf. She remained like this even when I moved closer to her. This one and this one are by the novelist I'm researching, and I pulled out 3 or 4 French translations of Yasunari Kubawata's novels. You can read one if you like, whichever, I'll lend you one. And with this, I gave her a rough outline of Snow Country, the House of the Sleeping Beauties, and the lake. As I was explaining the eroticism in the House of the Sleeping Beauties, I sneaked a peek at her. We're on page 69, nice. Finally, I asked her which one she liked, and she chose Kawabata's Snow Country. I then asked her if she'd heard of geisha. When she said she hadn't, I sensed a friendliness in her reply. Next, I took out a magazine that featured an article and photos of a round table discussion I had taken part in. While I showed it to her, I explained something about the 3 other participants. Then I pointed to my photograph. "This guy isn't doing anything," I said with a chuckle. "Even now," she replied, laughing. We weren't talking about anything serious, but she still came across as warm and considerate. After talking a little about my research, I took down my master thesis from the bookshelf and showed it to her. "You might be interested in this," I said, pointing to the chapter on the European avant-garde art movement. And take another swig here. Hold on, boys. She took the thesis and looked at the table of contents, but she didn't turn the page. "I'll give you a copy once it's published," I told her. That's what I'd already planned. As I passed her the thesis, I imagined the cover of the yet-to-be-published book in the palm of my hand. I asked her if she was going to do a DEA postgraduate, and we talked a bit about her studies. I then mentioned Professor Burt. Well, he said it's all lies," she said. "It's ridiculous. École Normale, France's highest institute of learning, is an extremely tough school." At her class presentation, a broad smile had lit up on the face of the professor sitting next to her. Would she also be going to École Normale after this, I wondered? I asked her when the students in Holland start learning foreign languages. Besides English, which is compulsory, we can choose French or German at high school. I chose German, but found it's too difficult so switched to French. English is the easiest, but maybe my French is better now. "But your German's really good," I said. "I know what I know, but what is it, the pronunciation?" She started laughing and blushing slightly. She turned suddenly to the copy of Yukiguni, and with her long fingers traced the black characters on its cover. "What does this say?" she asked. "That means snow, and this means country," I told her, explaining each of the characters. And with that we began to talk about the Japanese language. "So Japanese has an alphabet?" she asked. "Having come all this way," I told her jokingly, "you have a right to learn Japanese." And for a moment I was reminded of the French girls at the cafe the other day asking about Japanese. I took out some writing paper and drew a series of simple ideograms. Beside the picture for tree, I drew the one for person, and explained that together these formed the character of for resting. Next, I explained that Japanese has two alphabets, hiragana and katakana, and wrote them out on the same paper. After writing down the basic sounds A, E, I, O, U, I explained how the other sounds developed and overlapped. I then asked if she knew how to write her name in Japanese. She searched through the list for each sound and corresponded with her name, and by copying the letters I'd written out, effortlessly she wrote her name. She was quick to learn, and was able to write her surname and country name in no time at all. Afterwards, she took the list I had written out and folded it carefully before putting it in her bag. European languages are all very similar, but Arabic and Japanese are so different, she said. Why had she suddenly mentioned Arabic, I wondered. Was it because, as a Westerner, she thought all languages outside Europe were somehow the same? I felt a pang of disappointment at this. Although it was said in innocence, I couldn't forget it. Finally, she told me that she'd be going back to the Netherlands in the middle of July, and from there, setting off a big trip with a friend. Where to? I asked. Europe? Somewhere much further away, she said. Japan? I asked jokingly, and she shook her head with laughter. In the end, I misheard and didn't catch where she planned to go. What will you do after that? I asked suddenly. Well, she said, but there was no longer laughing. She sat there for a long moment in silence. I'll probably come back to Paris. And with this, her face lit up again with a big smile. That's great, I said, and also laughed. I'd probably have to go back to Japan around the same time, I thought to myself. I've got to go, she said. It was 10:30. I've got to look after the children tomorrow morning. I suddenly remembered the restaurant we ate at the other day, and how I had some instant food that had been sent from Japan. I took out some and gave one to her. One was a packet of curry. She looked at the back for the cooking instructions. Blah, 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 break, she read in a jokey manner, rolling her tongue and shaking her head until she came back to the last word, which was in English. That's the only one I can understand, she said, laughing. Domo arigato, she said, smiling, and put the curry in her bag. I followed her down the stairs so I could unlock the front door, but then decided to walk her to the metro station. She was in a good mood. It's really nice here, she said, as we came to the garden below my apartment. During the day, this little space was so full of birdsong, but in the still of night it falls silence, inhabited only by the dark trees. If there's a chance you'll come back to Holland, I'll give you my address, she said, with a smile as we left through the gate, adding, but I don't know if I'll be there or not. It was a pleasant evening, not very cold at all. As we neared the metro, I remembered our recent conversation. Didn't you say your older brother's been to Japan? I asked her. She hesitated before replying. Yeah, he went by boat from Southeast Asia, she said. So that was it, I thought. When Westerners come to Japan, they usually visit other Asian countries as well. For them, that was nothing out of the ordinary. But for some reason, I found this a rather unpleasant fact to accept. When we had descended the steep metro station steps and arrived at the ticket machine, she suddenly turned to me and said with a big smile, "Thank you so very much." For a second, I wondered why she was thanking me. You're welcome, I said. I'm just sorry about the food. No, it was good, except for all the smoke, she said, smiling sweetly. I'll never forget the slightly comical but soft and joyful way she pronounced the word smoke. See here. I think we're almost to the end of what has been translated so far, so we're just gonna finish what's on here, and then when this guy updates the forum, which hopefully he does, which I think he's updated it. Like the last update was in 2019, but the first post was in 2008, so I think he's still doing it. So we'll read what's available now, and then as soon as this guy translates some more, we'll read more in a second part. I'll contact the others about you going to see a movie once we arrive, or once we decide on a day. I'll call you, she said in a rather precise manner, and then started rummaging through her shoulder bag. Whatever she was looking for, she couldn't find it. So she slipped the bag under her. She slipped the bag from her shoulder and, placing it on her lap, opened it wide. I suddenly caught a sight of the bag's contents and felt I was peeking into her private world. I quickly averted my eyes. She was looking for her metro pass. Having found it, she said goodbye and disappeared through the ticket gates, rather. I left immediately without looking back, but suddenly wondered what the woman selling the train tickets had thought when she saw this tall young European woman and a short Asian man in friendly conversation before going their separate ways. It was still smoky in my apartment when I got home, and the mix of smoke, warm air, and the smell of sukiyaki made it difficult to breathe. I checked again to see that the window was open, and then noticed a dip in the bed covers where she had been sitting. I felt I could smell her. The chopsticks and bowl she had used were still on the table in front of the bed, and the cups and champagne glasses we'd drunk sake from were still on the desk. I licked the ends of the chopsticks, which had turned brown where she had put them in her mouth. Next, I poured what was left at the bottom of her champagne glass into my mouth and licked the green glass with my tongue. When I did the same with her sake cup, I noticed that her mouth had a strong smell of sukiyaki on it. I then wolfed down the meat and vegetables she'd left in her bowl. Was I really still hungry? More likely it was the smell of her that I was after. When I was at high school, I noticed the school lunch included a bottle of coffee milk. There was one girl, fairly cute, who would return her empty bottle to the crate. When no one was looking, I'd take her bottle, put it in my mouth, and pour the few remaining drops of the milk down my throat. I'll never forget how sweet it tasted at the time. For sure the taste was of coffee milk, but I felt like I'd tasted her as well. It was heavenly. I was too weak to attend gym class, and would often stay back in the classroom by myself. On many occasions, I couldn't resist opening the girl's empty lunchbox and licking the ends of her cute little chopsticks. My hands, my whole body would tremble, and the sense of guilt would terrify me. But at the same time, I would literally shudder with the joy I felt. For me, who had never kissed a girl, perhaps the act took its own form of embrace. I could even say that my guilt heightened at the peculiar sense of delight I felt. Even now, it seems I can still smell that girl's lunchbox. I didn't wash the bowl that Renee had used, but simply left it by the gas stove. The chopsticks were disposable, so I put them in their paper sheath and placed them on top of her bowl. Then I washed what I'd used myself. Due to the hot air and smell of smoke in the room, I at first decided to sleep with the window open. However, that would have let what remained of her smell escape from my room. So I closed the window tight. My intention was to fall asleep with the smell of her flowing through me. But when I lay down on the bed, I felt an indescribable surge of happiness. It was like a sense of satisfaction. And despite my exhaustion and feverishness, my mind jumped from one recollection of her to the next. Her words, her expressions, her laughter, all were as clear as day, but I couldn't help but smile with happiness. I felt unable to lie still, and in my head I shouted out to my closest friends, "I've finally got a girlfriend!" And then, quite suddenly, tears came to my eyes. In my mind, I began telling my friends about how wonderful she is. Next, as if quite normally, she was standing beside me dressed entirely in white. The look on her face was one of innocence. She nodded, and whispered in response the priest's words, "Till death do us part." Her fingertips softly trembled in my hand. Okay, yeah, so that is the end of the translation so far, unfortunately. So that is as far as we're going to be able to get tonight, but hopefully this guy will update it. So shout out to this guy who has been translating it. I was going to say what's his name here, because it's a blog here. I don't see him anywhere, but shout out to this blog and the guy who's translating it. You should say that to your friends. Pluck, fuck, what, in that order? Why? Why would I do that, Andy? But yeah, like I said, unfortunately, that is the end of the translation for the time being. There's still a lot more book, I'm pretty sure. I don't know how long it actually is, but I know that that's far from the end of it, because that's only the first 3 chapters. So hopefully he gets a start on the other chapters in the near future, but that was a very interesting read. I'm very much looking forward to reading the rest of it, if it gets released soon. I very much enjoyed that. Very interesting read. So I hope you guys had fun. A little bit of a different stream tonight, but it is also what won the poll, and I'm actually glad it is, because I had a lot of fun. But anyway, guess that's going to do it for tonight. So I'll see you guys later. Have a good one. Toodles.